So for lesson 3.5, we're going to start talking about rates and unit rates. Okay, so the first couple of lessons in Unit 3 have been about ratios. So we're going to start using this new word, or these new words that also start with R. So try and use Quizlet to make sure you understand the difference. But rates, ratios, and unit rates are all really important things to remember from Unit 3. When we talk about a rate is similar to a ratio, except it involves units. So let's say that I have a ratio 3 to 5. This ratio doesn't involve units because a unit is telling us what the numbers mean, okay? So when I just say 3 to 5, I don't know what 3 is referring to. And so a rate is when we start attaching a unit to these ratios. So if I say 3 to 5 apples to oranges, well, then I have a rate, okay? But before I add apples and oranges, this alone is just a ratio. And so this becomes really important in real life because we usually talk about the comparison between two things, okay? So let's say you're buying pizza and we could say the ratio is 27 to 3, but that doesn't mean anything until we say $27 to 3 pizzas, okay? So just the ratio alone doesn't give us any information, right? That would be confusing. So, but once you start saying, oh, it's $27 for 3 pizzas, these are the units, okay? These are the units. Okay, and units are important in math and science, right? If I tell you I walked outside and it was, 20 degrees, is that cold or is that hot? You need to attach the unit, right? Is it Celsius or is it Fahrenheit? Or is it something that you may not have heard of, Kelvin? And so using numbers alone is less specific than using numbers with units. Okay, and so this becomes really important because in life we see rates all the time, especially when we're shopping. So let's move down to this example here. So let's say you're shopping for fish and you go to a store and they say that 2 pounds of salmon fillet at a store costs $21.50. And then 3 pounds of salmon at another store costs $33.75. Well, if you don't know how to figure out which one is cheaper, then you're going to spend a lot of time in your life spending too much money on things. And so what we can do is we can find the unit rate. So the unit rate is a comparison of two numbers when one of those numbers is 1. Okay, so if we have pizza that's $27 for 3 pizzas, well, a unit rate would tell us how much for 1. And we probably want to know the price of 1 pizza, right? We probably wouldn't want to say, well, how much pizza do we get for $1? Right? Because then we're going to get a fraction of a whole pizza, and that's not as useful as saying, what's the price of a whole pizza? And so be careful when you're finding your unit rate, which is something to 1, make sure you're using the most logical unit when you're searching for 1. Actually, let's go back up to the car. So this happens specifically when you're traveling, right? How do we measure our speed? Well, we usually measure kilometers or miles per 1 hour, right? It's usually 1 hour. We don't usually say how many hours per 1 kilometer, right? We don't usually hear speed that way because that doesn't make as much sense to us. And so make sure the unit that you're trying to find is the one that makes the most sense. So the price per 1 pizza, or the example with the salmon here, we want to know the price per pound of salmon, right? Because then we can figure out how much is the cheapest and then buy that option if we're trying to save money. And then have you ever gone to the store before and they tell you that there's a certain number of something for a certain cost, like 6 bagels for $7.50? Well, that's great, but if you can't figure out how much one bagel costs, then you're not sure if the price makes sense or not, because maybe one is really expensive and you can't really figure it out from the rate that you're being given. So it's always good to be able to calculate how much for one thing. And the way we do that is I suggest let's keep using ratio tables since we started out using ratio tables. So let's pull up this example here. Actually, let's jump to 25. Usually the numbers that are bigger are the harder ones. So let's knock out one of these hard ones for you. So if we have $12 for every 5 ounces, I'm going to write that in my ratio form, 12.50 or 12.50 over 5. Okay, and the reason I'm going to write it that way is because I'm going to make a ratio table just because this is what we've been doing recently, right? So I'll make 4 little cells here. And so what I would want to do is figure out, what do I want to search for? Do I want to figure out how many ounces $1 is going to give me? Or do I want to figure out how many dollars per 1 ounce? Okay, and so you got to do some thinking first. And sometimes this might be difficult if you're not familiar with shopping or anything like that. In this situation, we're probably going to want to figure out what's the price per 1 ounce. Okay, so let's decide that we want to find 1 ounce. And then now we have a ratio table that has an empty spot, and I think we already practiced this the other day with our ratio stations when we went running outside. But now we got to do our division, and remember it has to match when we're talking about creating an equivalent ratio. We have to do the same mathematical operation. So what did I do, or what could I do to get from 5 ounces to 1 ounce? Well, I divide by 5, right? Because 5 divided by 5 is 1. And so then I have to do the same thing here. And now what we have is a division problem with decimals. So this is where, old math units come into play. You could just say, oh, I plug this into a calculator, but it's good to practice this division. So now I have to do 12.5 divided by 5. So I go 12.5, and I can keep that 0 there, or just to keep it consistent. So 12.5 divided by 5. And then I would just do my typical math, and I don't need to go over this because we've had previous units where we studied this stuff. Just make sure when you have a decimal that you raise it up, and you're going to get some amount that tells you how much 1 ounce is, right? So now you're going to learn the ratio of how much it costs for 1 ounce of something. And so we call this the unit rate. It's the rate per 1 unit of something, And in this situation, it's 1 ounce will cost a certain amount, whatever is in my division problem there. Okay, again, really handy stuff when you're shopping. You see it at the store all the time. Rarely are you given the cost of how much one thing is. So if you buy 12 eggs, for example, maybe you would never want to know how much 1 egg costs, or maybe you do, but if you use unit rate, you'll be able to figure out how much something costs per 1. So that was lesson 3.5, rates and unit rates.